Hello everyone, and welcome to the opening lecture for History 108. This will be a lecture that will cover some of the themes and objectives for studying early American history, as well as exploring the geographic foundations of what and where will become the United States. Now, with this first opening lecture, this is a good time to tell you that for every online lecture throughout the semester, I will always begin with a few introductory slides that will include the topic study guide questions that the lecture will cover. So these are the topic study guide questions that you will see directly from your study guide sheets. So by going over these questions with you, I will give you clues and hints of where the answers are in the online lecture. Could be in a series of slides with bullet points, could be some images I want you to focus on. So as I mentioned in the syllabus, structurally, these online lectures are designed to give information in a sequential manner that will help answer these questions for you. So as my recommendation is to have printed study guide questions from your Canvas site, and in the spaces I provide between questions, handwrite the answers from what you listen, what you see from the online lecture. So every online lecture will have the study guide questions that I will cover. So for our opening lecture, just like to start with five of the questions in the beginning from topic number 1. And the first one is a question I'm going to answer in 2 bullet pointed slides with lots of commentary and information. And that is, what are some of the themes and historical perspectives, both national and world, in studying early American history? So I'll cover things that are unique from the scholarly perspective of the United States history, or what makes the study of American history unique as opposed to studying the history of other nations and other times. So 2 slides with bullet points and commentary to give you that information on themes and historical perspectives. Then for number 2, with a lot of maps and images, I'll briefly describe how the original Native Americans arrived onto the Western Hemisphere. So it'll be a little bit of some cultural anthropology, but that'll be an opening question to establish the geographic setting for the future United States. Then for number 3, in a combination of a slide with several bullet points and with pictures, we'll just briefly survey the diverse lifestyles, social organizations, and civilizations found among the Native Americans within the ancient Americas. So a nice way of looking at how different Native Americans lived, what their lifestyles was like. That's just going to be a basic overview for question number 3. Then with number 4, I want one question to focus on information I'm going to give you about the history and life of 2 major Native American civilizations, the Aztecs and the Incas. So where do the Aztecs and Incas live in the Western Hemisphere? So that'll be pinpointing you geographically where they lived. And what kind of similar political systems did they possess? There's one very easily understandable political system that both the Aztecs and Incas lived under, and I'll mention what that is. And then we'll wrap up our opening lecture with number 5, where I will describe a typical European view of the known world in 1450. I'm going to do that with a map. That will be the very last image you'll see on this online lecture, and I will examine this map with you to help establish what people, especially the Europeans, knew about the known world, what continents existed, what bodies of water existed, and we will use that as the basis of European knowledge when ultimately they're going to come into contact with the Americas. I think you'll see and understand what I'm going to do with that particular question. So that'll wrap up with number 5, our very first online lecture. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and begin our look at the beginning, the origination story of the United States. Now, when studying the history of the United States, there are some very evident and striking themes and traits, characteristics when studying the history of the United States. They stand out and they're very unique from studying the histories of other nations. So let me go ahead then and tell you the first characteristic in studying the history of the United States. You're studying the history of a nation that is a direct creation of modern times. So first theme and trait of the history of the United States, you're studying a nation that is a creation, chronologically, of modern times. So I want to start by saying that when you study the history of the United States from a very broad world perspective, you're studying a nation that's relatively young by world historical standards. The United States is a very young nation. So what do I mean by modern times? It's a chronological era that historians generally use. So as a rough rule of thumb, from the Western perspective, there's 3 different eras in human history. In terms of civilization. You've got the ancient period that roughly goes about 3500 BCE all the way till the year 500 in the Common Era. So ancient history, you study the Greeks, the Egyptians, the ancient Romans. And then in the medieval period that follows after the ancient period, that era goes from roughly 500 to 1500, a 1,000-year period that we dubbed as the Middle Ages, the medieval period. And then the third and final era, once again from the Western perspective, when you break down chronologically world history, you study what's called the modern period. And the modern period usually begins approximately around 1500 and it continues to our present day. Although we can be a little nitpicky, and some historians like saying, well, we live in a postmodern era, or it's something like that. But we're still living in the modern era. So simply put, modern times within the scope of world history is roughly the last 500 years of world history. And it's within that period, the last 500 years, that's when the United States is born, when it is created as a nation. So it's a direct product of modern times. And how old, if we want to be specific, is the United States? Well, that depends who you ask, because there are different years that can be used to denote what is year 1 for the United States. You probably heard commonly this year, 1776. Because as we'll see, that was the year when independence was formally declared against Britain. So when you declare independence, isn't that your birth date? So how many years ago was 1776? Exactly 244 years ago. However, many people don't want to say 1776 because they say, well, we just declared our independence. We didn't have actual legal independence from Britain. So how about instead we use 1783 as the real first true year of the United States, because it was in 1783 that the American Revolution concluded and the United States made the peace treaty with Britain. So 1783 was 237 years ago. But a lot of people would say, no, don't do that because we still haven't had our stable government yet. We still need to make our constitution, and maybe only until you make a constitution, then you can truly declare that the United States is truly born. Well, you can say 1788 then, because it was in 1788 that the United States Constitution was ratified, and that was exactly 232 years ago. But then somebody would say, no, just wait, one more thing. How about mark year 1 when George Washington was inaugurated as president the very next year in 1789. So only until you have the first truly inaugurated president, then you have the true birth of the nation. And that was 231 years ago. So we got a range between 231 and 244. So whichever one that you would want to pick, this is a nation that is 2 centuries and 3 decades old. So around 230, 240 years old. That is still young by the standards of world history. And of course, those years fall into the scope of modern times. Or to be specific, the United States is a product, a creation of the 18th century. So compare that to other nations that still exist throughout the world, like Britain, for example, whom independence was achieved. If you want to look at the actual origins of how Britain became a sovereign state, then, of course, with connecting its history to England, Britain, is a creation of the medieval period. You can see the semblance of Britain form after the fall of the Roman Empire. So, depending how far you want to go back, I'll just keep it simple. Britain as a nation is about 5 times as old as the United States. And like many European nations, France, for example, Austria, Germany, they all have origins you can trace all the way back to the medieval period. And still there are other nations that are much older than the United States. Take China, for example. China is a nation that decidedly has been born in the ancient period. You can trace all the way back to ancient emperors, ancient kings. It could go back as much as 4,000 years. So China could be considered a nation 20 times as old as the United States. And many other ancient nations. India is another nation that pops into mind when you want to talk about really deep ancient roots. So if you look at the landscape of the geopolitical world, you've got nations that are really old, had their origins back in ancient times, and you have nations that were formed directly during modern times. Now, the United States, of course, isn't the youngest nation in the world. It's young, but not the youngest. Take, for example, a nation like Pakistan. Pakistan's formed after World War II. It was partitioned from India in 1947, so that's a creation of the 20th century. A nation like South Sudan has just been formed only less than 20 years ago. So nation building and creation is still going on, but that's an important characteristic to understand about the history of the United States. It has no medieval past. It has no ancient past. It is a creation of the forces of modern times. And that's going to be an important part to study when you look at the history and creation of the United States. Now, in addition to its youth, here's another major characteristic, trait, about the history of the United States. The nation was founded upon a very daring and risky political experiment. It's another key characteristic. The United States, politically, was founded upon a very risky and daring political experiment. And that experiment was simple. The desire to create the first modern republic, a republic that would have any significant chance of durability and longevity. Now let me put this in perspective for you. When you mention a government that is a republic comes from Latin, the Romans, res publica, meaning a public thing. And a republic is a form of government that has these characteristics. There's no king. Or if there is a king, this king is hollow, ceremonial, but there's no direct political rule or power that comes from a king in a republic. In fact, you have elected officials who are your national leaders. Could be presidents, could be consuls, could be prime ministers and magistrates. So there's always an elected official who runs the nation in a republic. Also in a republic, you have a division of powers. Powers that are divided between a presidency, a legislative body, a judicial body. So in other words, a republic is very sensitive to dividing up powers, so not one branch of government becomes absolutely powerful. Also in a republic, you always have elements of democracy, like voting. Who gets to vote, who gets not to vote. That's always what a republic then decides. And in addition to elements of democracy, you also have in a republic a notion of who its people are. And its people are considered citizens, not subjects. If you live in a monarchy, you're a subject to a monarchy. But in a republic, you're an actual citizen with rights, voting power, elements like that. Now, when I say that, we always thought, yes, America has always been a republic. That was its political foundation. But we have to understand that when the United States was created in the late 18th century, it was highly risky to implement a republic. Because if you go to the 18th century and you ask any political philosopher, and political philosophers just actually talk to you and they debate and convince you about what's the best form of government, and you said, is a republic good to implement in the 18th century? That political philosopher would say, no, don't do it. Because up to that time, republics have had very bad historical track records. The philosopher would argue that republics, what has been shown in history, are generally very weak. They're very short-lived, temporary. They don't seemingly project the grandeur of a government you should have, which is a superior monarchy. There's something about a monarchy in the 18th century that was well organized, that was majestic, that had that durable quality about it. And the philosopher would say, look throughout history, look at how empires, how major states had always had these very strong monarchies. And in the end, what happened to republics? They always seem to collapse. Look at examples like what happened to the Greek city-states. They ultimately collapsed. The most famous example of a republic collapsing after a good 5-century run was the Roman Republic before it descended into an empire. And then even in the medieval period, there had been Italian city-states. There had been short-lived republics in Poland, Lithuania. The Swiss government had a series of small republics, even a well-known Dutch republic. But in the end, they all experienced this general decline. So there was this view that republics were too chancy, too risky, and were not meant to last. So that's why that the founding of the United States and its political system was an experiment to see that could now we revive the idea of a republic for modern times. And what we need to do is we need to find out the solution. We need to go ahead and search for what can we do. It's a challenge to create a lasting republic that could stand the test of time. So that's the history of the United States, as you'll see. The rejection of implementing a similar type of 18th century monarchy and taking a chance to have a modern-day republic. Now, there's going to be many episodes in the history of the United States where that republic was fragile and it was going to be tested. But if you look at that time in the late 18th century, the political philosophers would have just said that this is what you should do as the normative government, not a republic. Because look at Europe in the 18th century, all monarchies, many of them absolute rulers. Look at in Russia, there is a czar who controls Russia. Look at China, there's an emperor who believes he's the son of heaven. Look in the Muslim world, the Ottoman Empire has a sultan. There are so many different examples throughout the world where power and real, true, stable political authority is encapsulated in some type of monarchical system. So that is going to be one of the other major themes that you'll see in the history of the United States. Putting in this experimental republic, and throughout the years of studying American history, always going back and checking, is this republic still working? Is it getting stronger? Is it moving forward? Is it possibly regressing? Could it collapse altogether? That is one of the major themes in the history of the United States, the continual assessment of how this risky and challenging republic that was put in, how is it currently doing? Now here's something else that's a major theme and trait when studying the history of the United States. This is a unique nation that was founded on ideals and principles. So what do I mean by that? Well, how does a nation get started? Who actually decides how a certain country is going to be created, and what basis is it going to be created upon? Well, various explanations range from, well, this one leader may have gathered people together and there was something that bound them together to make them a single people. It could be that they shared a certain religion, that they shared a certain language or culture. Maybe there was a defining moment in these people's history. Usually same ethnicity is also a basis of forming a nation. So there's always some kind of commonality, some kind of thing that binds people together, saying, this is our nation, this is our people. Now, what's interesting about building the United States is that it had defied most of what historically been traditional nation building. Can you create a country where it doesn't matter what your religion is, doesn't matter what your skin color is like, doesn't matter even what your philosophical views or your economic stature in life, but what would bind you together as a single people and constitute you as being a nation is if you shared certain ideals and principles. That is what is going to make the United States unique. It's going to be a nation really built at a table with men with funny-looking wigs and clothes that says, this is the idea of our nation. It is going to be anchored on these ideals and principles. So, what are examples of some of those ideals and principles that we've inherited today within the American experience? An unwavering belief, for example. Unwavering means never contested. It's always going to be there. You don't challenge it. Popular government. It's an example of one ideal. The American people had always believed that popular government is the basis of this nation. So popular, from populus, the Latin word for people. So we always believe that people in the United States should have a say in their government, make laws, choose their representatives, protest when they need to, address grievances. People want to be citizens and have an active role in their government. And that's the reason why that when the United States was formed and the break was made from monarchy, you have this switch from no longer seeing yourself as a subject, but an actual citizen. And the American people would never take any semblance away from popular government. Any kind of erosion or stripping away a popular government, that almost seems like to forsake the ideals and principles of what the nation was founded upon. So just always believe that popular government is the American way. And also the American people, building a nation, ideals and principles, always believe in freedom. This is probably one of the best historical examples of freedom-loving people in history. Believing also in liberty as well is another way of describing freedom. So we want all kinds of freedom. We want freedom to earn whatever living that we want, freedom to make which money we want, freedom of where to live, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of our own thoughts, freedom of whom to love. So freedom, 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 the more the better. That's another essential idea that would anchor the creation of the United States. And also equality as well. We are always a people that, if you look throughout the history of the United States, of how equality has been there, everything from the Declaration of Independence and to the expression of it in various civil rights movements. So anytime that we see any various inequalities in society, we always feel incumbent to rectify them. And that clashes with how most nations existed within history, where they thought there were natural inequalities between social classes, economic differences, but not the United States. It's a concerted ideal to always strive for equality and to enshrine that in our documents and our vision of what the United States is. And also justice. We are a nation that always strives to achieve full and complete justice, whether it could be political injustice, whether it could be economic injustice, criminal injustice, racial injustice. So every time that we see an injustice in society, it's something within the American ideal to once again rectify it, not leave it up to fate, not to accept it as it is, but to do something about it for lasting change because it's right. Justice is the vehicle that anchors within to try to live up to all the other major American ideals. So those are some examples then of some major ideals and principles laying the foundation for the United States. And there's also something else as well that's very key. And it is a little bit controversial, but the belief in American exceptionalism. So this is an idea that you can trace it to all the way back to colonial writings, where the belief is that the creation of the United States is something special. It's something unique, that with its ideals and the vision and historical destiny of the United States, it is somehow transcended into what other nations had previously done. So examples going all the way back to colonial Puritan times, where John Winthrop said that this is a city upon a hill, a beacon that everybody would view and look at and admire. Thomas Paine in Common Sense, as we'll see, described how that this was a moment in civilization where the sun is shining on us. Humanity and the oppressed throughout the world are counting on us to be created. Abraham Lincoln once said that in fighting the Civil War to preserve the Union, because the nation represents the last best hope on earth. So various ways of how American exceptionalism, that kind of pride is expressed, that's what also makes an important part of the study of the history of the United States. Now, there are some people who maybe bristle a little bit at American exceptionalism. They don't like the idea of taking the United States and singularly making it unique from other nations. It almost kind of puts it on a pedestal that maybe it shouldn't be there, or maybe it's deemed superior where it shouldn't be, that all nations are exceptional in their own way. But still, it's a very, very powerful belief and trait that you can see also underscores the history of the United States. Now, what are some additional traits and themes of the history of the United States? I just want to throw this in here. A new social and ethnic identity, the American people, Americans. So when we think of who we are as the American people, we're really just a people that in a sense had only been created within the last 2 centuries. There was nobody before 1776 that called themselves an American. And what's interesting is, even during colonial times leading up to the American Revolution, hardly anybody called themselves an American. So how in time that identity of being an American is going to be cultivated? How is it going to be defined and embraced, of how a new people on this planet, the American people, are going to be created? So is it just means that just because you're born in America or you're an immigrant naturalized as an American citizen that makes you an American? Or is it something more? Is it something you believe, something you accept, something of other additional ideals and values that make you an American? Because other nations had usually defined their national identity with race, blood, religion, other areas that make them a singular people. What in this particular case makes the Americans a unique people that have really only recently appeared in modern times? So how is that social and new ethnic identity then cultivated with Americans? Also, as another additional trait to study about the history of the United States is this. This is a story of a nation that is known for its phenomenal territorial expansion. This is a nation that its historical destiny will be, through war, through luck, circumstances, will stretch all the way from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast and beyond. That history would afford the United States a unique opportunity to territorially expand vast amount of land in a short amount of time that no other previous nation could have done, let alone if they wanted to create a full-scale empire. So how did the United States do it? That's another important part of the story. Because if you look throughout history, this is actually a gift. It's happenstance for a nation to truly territorially expand. Most nations can't do that because they could share 4 or 5 of their surrounding borders with other powerful nations that would have prevented them from expanding. So, for example, historically, France, with the exception of the Napoleonic era, was always going to be bound by the English Channel in the north, by Britain, by Spain in the south, by the German lands over into the east. Could not get any bigger in that sense. Many current day African nations are like that as well, that they just can't expand into much territory because they're sharing a continent with other powerful nation states. So we will look at the story of how the United States became a territorially expansive nation that would be very unique, that would be almost opportunistic in its history. What else do you study when you study the history of the United States? You're also studying a nation that historically has gone through many of its paradoxes. So paradox just means two ideals that you have, that you embrace, but they contradict each other. But you still believe in those both set of ideals. And how the United States goes through its paradoxes, it's going to be challenging. It's going to be sometimes very frustrating. It sometimes may be very hypocritical, or sometimes it may be very deadly. So the first obvious paradox that people think about when studying the history of the United States is that on one hand, you have a nation committed absolutely to freedom and liberty, but it also had slavery at the same time. Slavery was not going to be resolved until the end of the American Civil War in 1865. So that's a paradox. Can you have a nation that simultaneously will honor liberty, but also having slavery at the same time? Also, the United States is known as a nation for religious freedom. We'll talk about the history of that, of how the early colonies would cultivate the basic tenets of religious freedom. But at the same time, that there's also been examples of demonstrating religious intolerance as well. So Puritans, other religious groups as well. So can you have at the same time religious freedom and religious intolerance? And also other paradoxes that you'll see. The United States believes in self-rule. It's a self-determined nation, but at the same time, there's going to be various parts of its history where it's going to have colonies. So can you be a colonial power, but also believe in self-determination of peoples? So there's going to be many examples that you'll see of a nation as it goes through the trajectory of its history. How does it wrestle with its paradoxes? Because if it's a nation built on ideals, sometimes ideals may be too lofty. Maybe they might be too abstract. Maybe they just don't harmonize, correspond well to maybe the ugly realities of life. So a lot of paradoxes that we'll see that are also an important part of studying the history of the United States. And lastly, as one of the other major traits and themes that you look at in the study of the history of the United States is this. This is one of the great success stories in modern times. A success story where not only would this very fragile experimental republic that the founding fathers had implemented would go far beyond their wildest dreams, but they did not know that they created a nation where once it became free of being a European colonial power on the fringes of civilization in North America, would one day have a historical destiny to become a world superpower. That is the trajectory of studying the history of the United States now, is to go ahead and see how the United States went from a European colonial power to a world superpower. How was that done? And we'll get into part of that story, but you're going to see more of how that story develops when you take a modern American history class. Yes, World War II was a factor, the Cold War was a factor, but it also goes back into this. What are the additional traits about the American people, the American belief system, the way it sees the world, of how this was able to be done? And so, in fact, when you think about this, it is the United States, and its historical parallel is Rome. Rome was also one of the great successful republics within history, going from a small city-state in Italy to having this vast Mediterranean empire. And the other great successful republic in history is the United States to one day become a world superpower. The superlatives are there. One of the world's greatest economic powers ever, one of the world's greatest military powers. Its dominant cultural influence and economic power still dots throughout the globe. This is a story of remarkable success that very few nations have achieved. So there you have it. Some of the opening characteristics and traits that we'll look at, that we will explore in our course on early American history. So now, where are we going to go from here? How that we are going to begin this story? How about from the beginning, to use a cliche? Let's start with the geographic part of the world where the United States will appear. Now, you already know this. It's obvious. The United States will be created on the North American continent, in the Western Hemisphere, in the part of the world that we simply call the Americas. However, I don't know if you ever wonder this. Why is the United States geographically not in Asia? Why is it not an African nation, and why is the United States not in Europe? But why specifically the United States is on the North American continent? Well, to go ahead and begin, and as we look at the historical forces that will push it in the direction of North America, the first thing that you need to remember is that when the United States is created on the North American continent, it will come at a time in the early modern period where there had already been tens of thousands of years of human history already within North America, let alone all of the Americas. So the way that you want to look at it is the United States is not created in North America on this barren, pristine place, but already a place where tens of thousands of years of human history had preceded the history of the United States. So the way to look at this is the history of the United States is, in a sense, a very recent chapter in the span of human history in the Americas. And it's very easy to see. You can take any part of the world, especially Asia, Europe, Africa. You always see at one time in history one civilization dominate an area. Then another civilization comes and replaces it. It supersedes it. And just like bricks going up a wall, you can see on the bottom the bricks that was where the original foundation was. Then they had been replaced by somebody else that keeps going on the top and top. That's the layering effect that you see with civilizations then throughout the globe. A lot of civilizations, a lot of people, either that they just die out on their own or they're going to be replaced by other civilizations that come within the region. So the United States as a creation of modern times is in fact a very recent chapter in the human span and the history of the Americas. And maybe one way to visualize this is, let's say that we have taken the entire human history of the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, and we encapsulated the entire history within a 30-chapter book. So this 30-chapter book is from the beginning of human history in the Americas all the way to the present time. So what chapter do I need to go to where it begins talking about the history of the United States? Probably as early as chapter 27 and chapter 28. That is when you would begin in that book the beginning of the history of the United States. So with that in mind, what was the human history like in the Americas before the creation of the United States? How do we label it? How do we categorize it? Well, this is where the naming becomes an issue for most people of how to accurately and fairly describe what the historical era was like, who the people were before the arrival and the creation of the United States. Now, the most common description is to simply call it the ancient Americas. So if you see this in an academic history class saying I'm studying the ancient Americas, there is going to be the assumption that you're going to be studying the human history of the Americas before the Europeans showed up, before the creation of the United States. That's what you're doing. You're studying the ancient Americans. But also at the same time, there's another word that is used to describe this era in history. And it's not used a lot right now. This is just a traditional one that I remember when I was a college student. You also describe that period of the Americas as pre-Columbian history or pre-Columbian civilizations of the Western Hemisphere. And obviously Columbia refers to Christopher Columbus. So basically you're saying you're studying the history of the Americas before 1492. That's pre-Columbian civilizations, but more modern times it's called ancient Americas. So that's where it gets problematic, because both Columbia and Americas are European references. I'll reveal a little bit later where the actual word America came from, and Columbus refers to a European. So the fact that you want to identify what in a sense is Native American history, pre-Columbian history, you're going to have to do it by referencing the Europeans. It's difficult to find like an original term to describe that particular era before the Europeans showed up. So when you use the term Native Americans, yes, you have the word America in there from a European label. And even when you call them Indians, that's not used that widely that much anymore within academia, but it's the old traditional term. That also, as I will show you its roots, has nothing to do with a word that comes originally, indigenously, in the Americas. So that's the problem. That's a problem. What do you call the history, the era, and the people before the arrival of Europeans to describe those 27 odd chapters in that 30 chapter history of the Americas? But if you want to go back to the beginning to look at the history of the Native Americans within the Western Hemisphere, this is one thing we know for sure from archaeology, from the DNA evidence, from also what cultural and physical anthropologists tell us, and it is this. The current anthropological belief that stands today is that the human species, Homo sapiens, originated maybe about 200,000 years ago in East Africa. A lot of work in the 1960s by the famous Leakey family traced the origins of humans, and it's widely accepted among anthropologists that that is where the origination of the human species began. And then out of Africa began the migration of how the humans populated the rest of the world. So you have one group, the Neanderthals, 40,000 years ago, coming into Europe. 100,000 years ago, they're making their way across the Middle East and into South Asia. By the time of 70,000 years ago, one group is going down to present-day Australia. 50,000 years ago, that's where you have the indigenous Aborigines. And then you can see 30,000 years ago within New Zealand. Then 25,000 years ago into Asia. So that's where you see this initial trek out of Africa of human migration. That's how the world is going to, and the continents are going to be populated. And it's believed that the Americas, North and South America, were the last to be populated in this original migration out of Africa. It could have been as long as 15,000 years ago, maybe a little bit more, but from Asia, now you have the descendants of Native Americans come into North and South America. You can see that they're in the middle part of North America about 12,000 years ago and filtering their way down all the way into South America. And so far, there has been no archaeological, anthropological discoveries of any pre-Homo sapiens species within the Americas. That has not been uncovered yet. All the pre-Homo sapiens species, the skeletons, have been found in East Africa, and so this was the widely taught consensus view of the out of Africa theory, and then it leads for our purposes into how North and South America were populated, or in a sense, how did finally human history begin in the world of the Americas. And it's bolstered by modern day DNA evidence because of looking at a lot of Native American peoples. They can see similarities between Asian DNA genetic lines. Because right now, if you know how a lot of these genetic testings are done by companies, there's companies that say, okay, we'll send you a DNA sample, and you give us a DNA sample with a swab, and then we can go ahead then and project for you and trace all of your ancestors and where they were on this original migration route out of Africa at what time in history. So it's kind of fun to know kind of, what part of you is Asian, what part of you is European, so where your ancestors were on this line, but it fits that particular pattern. Now, you do have some people who disagree with this view. There's going to be people that say, well, it wasn't just the migration over from Asia to the Americas. They could have been arrived there by boats. Maybe it was Australians. Maybe it was Polynesians who landed in the Americas first. There's all kinds of theories, but the consensus view is the way that people populated the Americas, where human history began, is the out of Africa thesis. And looking at the physical Earth of the Western Hemisphere, just know this term. From a geographic standpoint, every time you use the geographic term Western Hemisphere, you're talking about North and South America. So North and South America, or the Americas, is synonymous with the Western Hemisphere. And this is the image of how the migration happened. A lot of you know today that what separates Asia and North America is the Bering Strait. There's actually water that actually makes them two separate continents. But migration occurred during the period of the Ice Age, where sea levels dropped. Sheets of ice and glaciers were everywhere, and therefore when the original migration happened, there was no sense that the people coming from Asia into the Americas were actually entering into a separate continent. They're probably foraging for food, trying to find animals to hunt, and therefore there was a natural land bridge. It's often called Beringia, that the ice was up, sea levels were low, and it made a perfect land bridge then for people to migrate from Asia into the Americas. And how long ago was it? Well, one number said 15,000, another one said 18,000, but this was going to be the migration route to get into the Americas. And it was only until after the Ice Age was done, maybe around 10,000 BCE, when now the sea level started to rise, all this land bridge then disappeared, and then you have the distinct Bering Strait as we know it today. So statements like this, migrations may have occurred along coast and across occasional sea ice, so maybe there was sailing in some parts, but it definitely was the pathway into the Americas to begin human history within the Western Hemisphere. And these are just simply artist representations to give us a sense of what that migration then from Asia would have been like. And then through now these many thousands of years of filtering into North and South America, and now truly feeling isolated and separated because they lost now that route back into Asia, what new ways of life would now Native Americans would develop? And once again, the Native American its expression is just a catch-all to describe all the peoples. I know it's kind of a large catch-all of describing them as they were the human inhabitants and their history in the Americas before the arrival of the Europeans. So how do they live? In all kinds of very diverse ways. Started out as nomadic hunters and gatherers, that they would hunt for food. They would also gather plants that were already grown. So many Native American people made their early lives, their way of life in the Western Hemisphere as nomadic hunter-gatherers. And then eventually, learning about agriculture that many other civilizations in the world had learned, semi-sedentary, learning to grow crops like maize, for example. And now that you're going to stay put in one location to tend your crops, now you can build villages. Now you can build shelter. Now you can develop new social networks and structures that now call for you to be an agricultural settled people. So that's another example of a lifestyle that you would see from Native Americans within the Western Hemisphere. But also some other Native American peoples would take it to another level, that they saw themselves as urban dwellers, building cities as well, learning to how to build structures that now could accommodate hundreds, if not thousands of people. So you saw examples of that kind of way of life within the Americas as well. And then finally, there's going to be some peoples we're going to see coming up that decide to take it further and go beyond urban city life to now create sprawling political empires as well. So that vision of empire, advanced civilizations, science and technology and art, it's also going to be adopted by some Native American peoples. And that's just what I want to stress is you can't define one way of life for all the peoples within the ancient Americas for that period of time. A lot of it's going to depend upon geographically where they lived, what the environment afforded to them. Maybe a different political system that's going to be different that they saw. So the key word is diversity. It's hard to describe Native Americans as a single people. So here's one way of seeing this. By 1492, which of course is the critical year when Christopher Columbus shows up, so that's why it's always used as a dividing line to separate the pre-Columbian world and the world of the arrival of the Europeans. It's probably estimated that there was about 350 to 500 major tribal groups in all of the Americas. So the tribe, the fundamental social and political unit, so that alone defies them as being seen as one single people. And of the 350 to 500 major tribal groups, you had as much as 15 major cultural regions and 160 major linguistic groups. So yes, they're not speaking the same language. There's a diversity of languages that matches in some ways dispersed throughout their major cultural regions and their major tribes. So simply put, enormous diversity. This is a quick map to look at North America, since this is obviously what we're going to focus on is the geographic place where the United States would be created. But if you look at this little caption here, by 1400, less than 500 years before the Europeans arrived, 10 million Native Americans lived in North America, north of present-day Mexico. Spoke at least 500 different languages. That's going to be more than what the previous figure said, so maybe talking about different dialects as well, and different cultural regions. And so when you look at this, 10 million, maybe it doesn't seem like a lot, but that's only in North America. There was going to be more that was going to live in Central, what is known as Mesoamerica, South America. So some high estimates that I have seen is range from roughly around maybe 75 million. That was the Native American population in the Western Hemisphere by the time that the Europeans showed up. But most of it, Central and South America, maybe about 10 million in this region that would one day become part of the United States. And you can see the division, the different regions. Far north, the California, Pacific Northwest, the Southwest where the Apaches, the Navajo were, the vast Great Plains where hunting and gathering took place among the Dakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, the eastern woodland Indians, the Huron, the Iroquois, Delaware, Miami Indians, and in the southeast where we're noted for the Cherokee and the Cherokee Indians. So you can see with this particular image that, and with the images I'm going to show you right now, just the enormous diversity. And it depends upon what Native Americans did in what part of the Western Hemisphere. Here you can see, probably during prehistoric times, an artist representation of what it was like to go on the hunt. And then you would also see the formation of a semi-stationary life of staying in one location. You can see also the huts, the villages, the gathering of food, division of labor. And then other areas where you can see a little bit more advancement. In present-day Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, you have Native Americans making images like called petroglyphs, the images that tell their stories, the way that they viewed the world. And in Chaco Canyon, the multi-level apartment houses, the remnants still are with us today of now what you can have as apartment dwellings, of now having Native Americans live in much more dense populations. In present-day Illinois, there was a site called Cahokia, the Cahokia Mounds, an urban center. Its height was around the year 600 that could have had as much as 10,000 people. In a lot of ways, this could be viewed as the first major city in North America. The mounds sometimes go as much as 100 feet high. This is an artist's representation of what it may look like within its height. So you can see much more of a dense urban setting like what you would find in Cahokia. go into Mesoamerica, like present-day Mexico, Central America, you still see the legacy of the Native Americans. This is the famous Olmec basalt head made of the stone. It's about 9 feet high, and various heads you would see that would stretch from various parts of Mexico, like La Venta, San Lorenzo, and they provide an intriguing archaeological relic from that past. Whether or not that these are images of the rulers, or whether if they were athletes, because it looks like a helmet. So you have a lot of these iconic images that are representative of the enormous diversity and artistic and cultural achievements of various Native Americans. And also some of them were going to be stupendous builders as well. Pyramids were going to be very common in the world of Mesoamerica, meaning the middle of the America, present-day Central America. This is the famous Teotihuacan pyramid, about a 650-foot base, about 213 feet high, something comparable to what the ancient Egyptians were doing. So even classic Mayan civilization also emphasized the building of pyramids. So you have here just some quick visual examples that the enormous diversity of Native American peoples, ranging from hunter-gatherers, semi-stationary farming lifestyles with small cities, and, as we're about to see right now, sprawling empires. And I want to look at 2 of these empires and a mini history of these people to show you the apex of advanced civilization within the Americas, and also talking about these civilizations who will have encounters directly from the arrival of the Europeans. So that's going to be coming up. And let me just show you one other image of the tribes of the Indian nations in North America. So it outlines here for you the present-day United States and where these Native Americans lived. Cherokee, Seminole, and Florida. So some of them you can identify with that particular region and history, but it's important to know some of these basic tribes because of their interactions with the Europeans and the ultimate creation of the United States. So many episodes, as we're going to see here with these various Native Americans and their history that goes back sometimes tens of thousands of years. And the new chapter that is going to unfold in the history of the Americas when the Europeans and the creation of the United States would take place. And so, just to begin first talking and coming up about the Aztecs and the Incas, I just wanted to kind of show you this image throughout the world of when the earliest civilizations appeared, in where and what part of the world. So, for example, 5, Mesopotamia is where the first civilizations in the Middle East appeared, the Sumerians, Babylonians. Number 4 is the site where in the Nile River Valley ancient Egypt occurred. West African civilizations in India and China. But if you look at the isolated Americas, so remember that they're cut off from the rest of the Eurasian landmass, it's going to be here in 1 and 2 is where you're going to see advanced civilizations. The Aztecs will be here, and the Incas will be here in a place called Andean civilization. But let me get into a little bit more detail of this. First, the Aztecs. This is where you see a Native American people reach the height of a powerful and sprawling militaristic empire. In a lot of ways, the Aztecs are another success story of a people in the history of the Americas. They seem to appear in history maybe around the time of 1200. And they were a nomadic, wandering people. They were known as the Mexica people. And this is incidentally where we're going to get our word Mexico come to, where it's going to arrive. And wandering, they finally established themselves, after they settled down, into present-day central Mexico and would build one of the most sprawling, if not terrifying, empires in the Americas, the Aztec Empire. And this is the extent of what the Aztec Empire would look at like right in the heart of present-day Mexico. So in a lot of ways, the history of Mexico is tied very closely with the Aztec Empire. And there's a story about how the Aztecs finally created their empire, and it goes like this. As a wandering people, they kept wandering and wandering in the northern part of present-day Mexico, and they didn't know when to stop or where to stop. Would they look for a sign of where to stop. And according to their god, they were told, you can stop and build your civilization when you see this image. And that image was of an eagle perched on a cactus with a snake in its mouth. Kind of an odd but unique symbol, unique image. And the Aztec Mexica people were told, you see that? Don't water anymore. Stop. And then build your civilization. So according to legend, they saw that image of the eagle perched on a cactus with a snake in its mouth, and it just so happened to be in this area near this lake, and it was in the spot that the Aztecs decided to build their capital city of Tenochtitlan. And that became the Aztec capital, the heart of this Aztec empire. And the god that was a principal god that gave them this image to look for, a god that had it's hard to pronounce name, but it's Huitzilopochtli. And that was the vision that drove the Aztecs to now become a settled people, stop their nomadic ways, and to now build one of the most fascinating and memorable empires in the history of the Americas. And how do we know and remember that story and how it's tied to the history of Mexico? Simple. You recognize this. This is the Mexican flag. It's distinct for its three colors, the green, the white in the center, and the red. And within the white background in the center, you have this image. And you blow it up. What's that image? Eagle, perched on a cactus with a snake in its mouth. And should it also be no surprise that where Tenochtitlan is located today, it's the same spot where future Mexico and future and present Mexico City is. So that's the tie in the history, and you can see that story of the Aztecs and that image right there on the Mexican flag. And here's just some quick images of Lake Texcoco when Tenochtitlan was built, because already it was going to be an engineering challenge that without modern construction equipment, no draft animals, no modern tools, they were going to build one of the most dazzling metropolis cities in the Americas, if not in the world at the time. A city virtually on a lake in a valley, that the only way to access the city is through man-made causeways, bridges, and also taking into account that they would have to account for a lot of engineering features when they're in this particular lake. So this is once again just artist representations of what Tenochtitlan may have looked like. And when people do notice this, what do they see? They first see the pyramid structures. A lot of pyramid structures within Tenochtitlan. There were always clean streets that even had daily refuse pickups. The canals, the causeways, and areas of open marketplaces where you could see vendors. You also had elaborate homes for nobles where they dwelled. So there was, class. There was class structure within the Aztec Empire. And what was reportedly an imperial palace where the Aztec emperor lived that had 100 rooms and covered close to 6 acres. So overall, when you think of Tenochtitlan on the lake, right in the valley, made all by hand by the Aztecs, and it'll be the seat of their empire, where they'll have additional provinces and they'll conquer people, and yes, they're going to have also grisly human sacrifice as well. This was a city that may have had 250,000 people at its height. So the Aztecs are just one of the best known Native American peoples reaching the apex of civilization. Now, the other contrasting political military empire, that's what the political system that they have in common, is both of them are militaristic empires, the Aztecs and the Incas. Now here's the geographic difference. The heart of the Aztec Empire is in present-day Mexico, but the Inca Empire was located in present-day Peru. So we go to South America on the western coast. But there's a much more precise term to describe what kind of civilization the Incas were, and you already saw it in the previous image, the Andean civilization. It's named after the Andes Mountains that runs along the western side of South America, and it's one of the highest mountain ranges in the world after the Himalayas. So this is incredibly a mountaintop civilization. or even shouldn't say a mountaintop. I should just say an 8,000-foot high altitude civilization on the Andes Mountains. This is a civilization that's not going to be built at sea level. They're going to conquer the geographic challenge of building a civilization within one of the largest mountain ranges within the world. It was going to be a system where, once again, without draft animals, without wheeled transportation, they need to build roads to foster trade, communication, getting things from sea level. And there was something about the Inca people, short, squat, but powerful lungs, that they could adjust themselves well into this high altitude civilization. And there was also elaborate ways of communication, imperial bureaucracy, a system of memorizers who could recount the history. And yes, they were going to be a conquering people as well. So just like how the Aztecs conquered non-Aztecs, the Incas would conquer other non-Incas throughout South America. And this gives you an idea of the scope from period of 1463 to 1532, what was considered to be the height of the Inca Empire. So here is Cusco, which is regarded as the capital, and here's Lima in present-day Peru. So even though you would see the Inca Empire spread north into modern-day Ecuador and south into present-day Chile, it's always going to be present-day Peru that's going to be identified with the empire of the Incas. And one of the most emblematic, iconic images that when people see it, they right away will associate with the Incas, and that is going to be their fabulous ruins on Machu Picchu. And Machu Picchu was these elaborate buildings, these structures that was high on a mountaintop, almost like touching the sky. So easily about 8,000 feet altitude. And it's a popular tourist spot where very hardy adventurers want to go up on scale all the way up to Machu Picchu to see these ruins. It actually only been rediscovered in the early 20th century by an American adventurer, and people are just dazzled by what they see in Machu Picchu of how do the Incas build this complex of rooms, buildings so high on the mountaintop. What was its particular purpose? And then you can see a little bit of a clearer view of Machu Picchu. It almost just kind of seems like kind of a celestial oasis, isolated, pristine, almost sitting on top of the world. And there's a picture of the llama that's also characteristic of an animal of South American civilization. So yes, it attracts so many tourists a year for, like I said, the very hardy adventurers. And you do also have to be careful when you visit Machu Picchu, because there's not a lot of things that can protect you once you get to the top. You have to be very careful where you step and where you walk. There had been some reported deaths of some people up in Machu Picchu. Some of them had died of heart attacks, or they just didn't acclimate well to the thin air, and it aggravated some pre-existing medical condition. There was also reports of people falling to their deaths when they, I don't know if they fell all the way down, but fell down into ravines because they just weren't watching. The steps were narrow, or they tried to jump from maybe one rock to another and fell. I think there were a few reports of people actually falling because they were taking selfies and, just wanting to kind of take in the background that sky so it looks like in their world. But nowadays you just got to be careful when you take a picture of yourself, especially if you're up in that high altitude. So also, the Peruvian government has now seriously thinking about putting limits about how many people that they're going to allow up here. Even though it's a major tourist attraction and it brings in a lot of money, with so many people visiting year after year, would it compromise the archaeological integrity and the grounds? Would something be lost if so many people came up to this particular region? That's also kind of something else to think about when you think of Machu Picchu, but it is what you would see as something of an engineering, an architectural triumph, conquering the elements that really, really defines the advanced levels and the pursuits of the Incas as well as the Aztecs and what they were able to accomplish within Mexico. So there you have it. When you look at the Western Hemisphere again, the tens of thousands of years of human history that was already there within the Americas, diverse cultures and peoples and views and structures of civilization. And then now we know this. That world is now gone. That world will vanish through the forces of modern times. So you no longer have the Aztec Empire, no longer have the Incas, you no longer have independent Indian peoples anymore within the Americas, no longer their vast states and cities anymore. They had vanished because when the Europeans came, their culture, their civilization will supersede that, and the Europeans will now write new chapters in the history of the Americas. Very recent chapters, but very transformative chapters. So with the Europeans, and then eventually the most recent chapter in the history of the Americas is this: the creation of modern day nation states in the Americas. This is the current map of all those nations within the Western Hemisphere today. And the United States is obviously one of them. So really, what is the most recent chapter in the history of the Americas is you enter a period in the modern times after Columbus where you're going to see now the Americas be carved, be created of having these European colonies. European colonies will then be made. But then in time, the people living in those colonies will rebel against their European nations. And it leads to what we see today. Every single independent nation state we see in the Americas was once a European colony, including the United States. So that is the most recent chapter, the independent movements where these European colonies became nation states within the Western Hemisphere. So the United States is an important story in how that happens, but keep in mind it's not the only story. So Mexico also has an independent story. Cuba does as well. Brazil, how did Brazil become an independent nation? So that's kind of where you see collectively the United States shares the same story with other nations within the Western Hemisphere. But our main focus is, how was the United States created? I mean, we already said it's going to take place in North America, but why here? Why here in this particular region of North America? That was going to be the setting for the birth of the United States. Well, before I leave this lecture, I want to give you a little bit more of what I call this prehistory, this establishment, to help you understand what those forces and that historical path would be to help create the United States here. And I'm going to go ahead and start by going to this world map. You've seen this world map before, this flat map of all the continents within the world. It's so familiar to us, of North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Middle East, Asia, Australia here, all of that. And we take it also for granted that we live in a true 21st century global world where everybody, no matter where they are and what part of the world, has with them a comprehensive map of the globe. Every inch of the Earth's surface is now accounted for. We just simply know where things are. But that wasn't always the case. Historically speaking, and yes, even well into the modern period, people lived in their own isolated, fragmented parts of the world, and quite frankly had no idea that other people, other lands existed. It's a world where in modern times the goal was try to bring people together, to create this idea of a single global unit. And that pursuit to create a single global unit is on one hand a historical event of modern times, but as I will show you, the United States' story is a product of that global development. Let me tell you what I mean by this. Let's go to the year 1450. So from our present time, what is that? About 570 years ago, something like that. We'll just kind of round off. For 1450. And I want to specifically select that year because that's going to predate Christopher Columbus, all these European explorers. And you're going to see why that I want to choose that date, 1450. Now, let's go to Europe in 1450. I guess it doesn't matter if we're in London, or it doesn't matter that we're in Paris, but let's say we meet a guy on the street, and we'll call him Joe Europe. And Joe Europe sounds like, looks like a very smart, intelligent guy, and we ask him this question in the year 1450. Could you draw for us a complete map of the world? Everything you know of what exists in terms of the continents, the bodies of water, the shapes of the continents, where everything is, I want you to do it as accurately as you can. So the challenge of Joe Europe in 1450 is to make a comprehensive map of the world, the known world that you think Joe Europe would know exists in 1450. So what do you think that map would look like? Joe Europe's map, and he's maybe pretty smart, would probably look like this. His map would include Europe, because that's his backyard. Doesn't matter if he's living in England. He knows France exists. He knows Spain exists. He knows all the adjoining European nations. So obviously Europe would actually really be, in a sense, the center of his world. Now what else would be included? The Middle East. Because since ancient times, Europeans had trade, political connections to the Middle East. The Roman Empire bound Europe with the Middle East together. Crusades happened in the medieval period. So yes, the Middle East would obviously be known as another land region that would be part of the European world map. And then also, as we venture further out east, India, the world of South Asia, would also be included in Joe Europe's world. That you had the connection of the Islamic Empire, Mongol Empire, that brought this world of the Middle East, South Asia into the knowledge orbit, geographic orbit of the Europeans. And also you had Alexander the Great, also had conquered along the outskirts of India. So even in ancient times, India was known. And going further, how about China? Oh yes, China and Europe had already known each other since ancient times. It was through trade routes, and I'm going to elaborate more on the next lecture. So yes, China is not an unknown to the Europeans in 1450, and why also not throw in Russian civilization as well, since it's directly on top of China. So that's what you got so far. Europe, the Middle East, Asia, South Asia. I would give a little bit of Southeast Asia, but generally the whole entire Eurasian landmass, if you look at Joe Europe's map in 1450, that was what would be included. Now, here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. Would present-day Japan be on Joe Europe's map? In other words, would the average European in 1450 have knowledge of the existence of Japan? That's kind of a yes and no question, because the famous explorer Marco Polo, who was traveling China about a century and a half earlier, before 1450, he talked about Japan using the word Cipango, because the Chinese knew about the existence of Japan. But however, even though Europeans are aware that a land of Japan exists, no European had ever been there before. And without being there, they know nothing about the shape, how Japan looks. So without that knowledge, Japan would be the first noted absent area on Joe Europe's map. You also know what else would be absent? Probably this region of Indonesia, the islands in the South Pacific, the area, what we call the Indies, that I'm going to elaborate on more. European explorers hadn't been there, even though the Arab traders had been there. They would know about it in their world map, but not the Europeans. And also the land down under, Australia and New Zealand, would not be on Joe Europe's map. No European had ever been to Australia and New Zealand. So without that knowledge, not on Joe Europe's map. And next is Africa. And this is a little bit tricky, but I think you can see the logic behind it. Was Africa known to the typical European? Yes, but only this area of North Africa above the Sahara. Don't forget, this connection within Europe and North Africa is bound by the Mediterranean Sea. So Carthaginian Empire, Roman Empire had always bound North Africa to Europe. But the areas south of the Sahara, as you go further south in Africa, complete unknowns. No European had ventured here, had explored it. So I would bet Joe Europe's map would come right about here in this area of Africa. So let me go ahead and show you what Joe Europe's map potentially looked like so far. Probably like this. That is a European world view. And that would be as far as it would go, because areas that would not be on Joe Europe's map, absolutely no knowledge of the existence of North America and South America. Even though there were European Vikings in North America several centuries earlier, they didn't map out the region. They didn't bring it to the attention of Europeans. A lot of the Viking voyages were mostly forgotten. But no European knows about the existence of these lands in the Western Hemisphere. And in fact, the western border would have been probably just along the Atlantic. That was about it. That was the belief of where the western edge of the earth had ended. And also the other things that would be absent, no true knowledge of the Pacific Ocean. The largest ocean in the world, the Pacific, was unknown to a European in 1450. No European had traversed it. No European had explored its scope and its size. It just doesn't exist on a European map in 1450. And we can go further, the ends of the earth, no knowledge of North and South Pole, Antarctica. That's not going to be part of the world map until the 20th century when exploration would be done there. So once again, Joe Europe's map is just this. This is the common world map for a European at this time in 1450. Okay? So it's interesting to think that when you think of these fragmented worlds, that's just from Joe Europe's perspective. What would happen if I went and visited Joe Aztec in Tenochtitlan in the same year of 1450 and I asked him the same thing? Draw me a map of the whole entire world as you know it. You know what his map would be? Probably just maybe more than 50 miles from where that he lived in Tenochtitlan. How would somebody living in the Aztec Empire know the existence of all these lands? It's not part of his worldview. It's just only here. He doesn't even know much about South America. Same thing. Why don't I go visit a Japanese farmer in maybe Kyushu, ask the same thing, 1450, draw me a whole map of the world. It only would be just a few miles from where he was. Just no knowledge of all these lands and the full extent of the world. So you see my point. In 1450, as history heads into modern times, people still were isolated from each other. They lived in their own clusters, their own quote-unquote worlds, if you will. Worldviews were very provincial, they were very fragmented, and we are still a long ways away of thinking in terms of a true, full global society. As I mentioned right before we began this slide, one of the main storylines of modern times is how do these people, these lands that have been isolated from each other for centuries, if not thousands of years, now finally come to meet each other? How does that process happen? How does the process happen where now their individual world maps will dissolve and they're going to realize that they're all part of a singular global world system? That's one of the exciting storylines in the modern period. And it's only going to be complete until the 20th century when finally every square inch of the Earth's surface is now accounted for. And in that story, one of the, subsidiary storylines, subset storylines, is going to be the creation of the United States. The creation of the United States is going to be a product of this effort to bring the whole world together into this single global unit. So what it means is, who's going to begin the process to bring the world together? You know that it's going to be the Europeans that are going to do it. And when the Europeans launch the age of exploration, it's going to create consequences and effect for world history that not only bring the world together, but it will set the events in motion where now finally the Europeans are going to be aware of the Americas and North America. And it's from that first step we will see the route and the creation of the United States. So for now, continue to take care of yourselves, stay well, and I will see you again shortly for our next lecture. Bye-bye.